Today on CodeDependent, we will be talking about the new fade effect in Flex 4. This effect is pretty much like the fade effect in Flex 3, although we're trying to fold in more intelligence into the effects as we go, fade and other effects, to more automatically handle situations that are going to be common. So in particular, fade is operating on the alpha value of its target objects, right? Alpha is in charge of the translucency of the object. So when alpha is 0, the object is completely transparent. When it's 1, the object is completely opaque. And when it's in between, it's some degree of translucent. So you can see through it to objects beneath it. So fade is used to change alpha over time, so you can fade things in from being completely invisible to completely opaque, or the other way around, or anywhere in between. So that's useful if you are actually changing the alpha value on the object, or if your states actually declare alpha values between the states and use transitions to say, now do a fade. But it's more useful if you can actually assume that you want to fade in and out based on the values of other related properties. So for instance, if an object is not visible on the screen and then it's visible in the next state that you're going to, it would be nice if we could automatically assume that you want to fade that in. Or the other way around, if it's visible and then invisible, we want to automatically fade it out. Even more powerful is if an object simply doesn't exist in one state and then it's parented in the hierarchy invisible in the state that you're going to, well, why don't we go ahead and assume that you actually want to fade that in if you've applied a fade effect. So some of this stuff actually worked in Flex 3, but you also needed to involve other effects like remove child action and add child action and carefully choreograph things in sequence effects to actually get the effect that you were looking for. So what we've done is try to do a little bit more of that automatically in the fade effect itself for the new Flex 4 effect. So let's take a look at how that works. So we have an application here I've called Auto Fade, and there's 3 buttons. In addition to the toggle state button. The toggle state is simply toggling the state between the start state and the second state back and forth. But there's 3 buttons, only one of which is visible in the first state. So this first button actually changes its visible property over time. Another button changes its alpha property between the states. And the other button is either parented or not parented. So let's see what happens. When we toggle from the first state to the second state, we fade in the other 2 buttons and the visible button fades out. And then back and forth, same thing happens over time until you're really bored with the application, at which point you go look at the code instead. So we've declared 2 states in here. We have them named State 1 and State 2. Awesome names. We have a single transition, which is going to kick in whenever we're changing states in the application. And the transition is simply going to run a fade effect. Now, notice this is one of the powerful things about Flex in general, is that we assume a lot of information from the state information. So when you specifically run an effect inside a transition, we go out and ask the start state and the end state, okay, what are the property values in these states, and what can we assume about changes in those property values over time in the context of this effect, so that we can automatically figure out what values you want to go from and to. So we simply say, we want to fade these buttons. We don't tell you fade in or fade out because, well, it depends on whether those things are coming in or going out. Right? So now let's take a look at what the actual state values are for the objects. So for button 0, that's the one that had the label of visible at the top. We're going to see that it has a label of visible. That's fascinating. It has a value of visible of true in the first state. And then in the second state, it has a value of false. Right? So it's visible, then it's invisible. We're going to automatically fade that thing out over time. So even though we're animating alpha, we're actually looking at the visible property to determine what we actually want to do with alpha for the duration of the effect. The second button is a little bit more obvious. Alpha is 0 in the first state. That's why it wasn't visible at all. Alpha is 1 in the second state, completely opaque. So we automatically assume, oh, okay, well, we're going to animate alpha from 0 to 1 during the fade effect. And the third button is probably the most interesting. It's going to be included in State 2. So this is new state syntax in Flex 4 that I won't get into, but it's basically saying it doesn't exist in the hierarchy. It does not exist in the GUI at all in State 1, but it does exist in State 2. So the fade effect, when it runs during a transition, it'll say, oh, it's not parented here, so that's equivalent to an alpha value of 0 if you want me to fade it, and it does exist in this other state, and that's equivalent to having an alpha value of 1. So I'm going to automatically set the alpha values, the from and to values of alpha, to 0 and 1, and it's going to fade in. Conversely, when we move from State 2 back to State 1, it says, well, it exists in State 2 and it doesn't exist in State 1. So they must want me to fade it out over time. So we're going to animate alpha automatically from 1 to 0. So run it again. We can see the visible button goes away when we go into state 2. The other two buttons come into being. They fade in. And when we go back to state 1, the inverse happens. So that's the new fade effect in Flex 4. If you want to see this application and other related graphics stuff, go to my blog at graphics-geek.blogspot.com.